They tell you that drowning is peaceful, that the body relaxes, that the panic gives way to something like acceptance. They're wrong. Nora Whitfield knew, because she'd watched her younger brother nearly drown in the Rideau River when he was 7, and there was nothing peaceful about it. There was only the terror in his eyes and the way his small arms beat the water like he was trying to fight the entire river. She'd jumped in without thinking. She always jumped in without thinking. That was her problem, her mother used to say. Nora leads with her heart, and her brain never catches up in time. She was 31 now, and nothing had changed. It was February in Ottawa, the kind of cold that didn't just bite. It swallowed you whole and forgot to spit you out. The canal was frozen solid, the way it always was in winter, and families were skating under the grey afternoon sky, the way they did every year during Winterlude. Nora was cutting through Confederation Park on her way back from her second job, the gift shop shift she'd picked up, because her mother's home care costs had gone up again and her regular salary at the elementary school barely covered rent. Her feet hurt. Her back hurt. She had $40 in her wallet, a broken zipper on her coat, and exactly one working earbud. She almost walked past the crowd. People were clustered near the edge of the canal, phones out, necks craning. Nora heard the word before she saw what was happening. Hole. There was a hole in the ice, maybe 2 meters across, near the bank where the ice thinned every year, despite the warnings, despite the signs, despite all the orange pylons the city put out. And in the water, small hands gripping the broken edge, was a child. A girl, maybe 9 years old, her dark coat spread around her like a wing, face white with shock. The child wasn't screaming anymore. That was the thing that moved Nora's feet before her mind could argue. Children who had stopped screaming were children who had stopped fighting. Nora dropped her bag and ran. She hit the ice on her stomach the way she'd seen them teach on those safety videos at school, spreading her weight, crawling toward the edge on her forearms, because standing would send her through too. Someone behind her was yelling. Someone else was calling 911. The girl's eyes found Nora's across the ice and held on. "Hold on," Nora said. "Don't let go, I'm coming." She got close enough to grab the child's wrists. The ice cracked under her own weight, and she felt the shock of water on her knees before she got purchase on the bank and pulled with everything in her until the girl came up out of the water gasping, and Nora dragged her back from the edge on her stomach. She got the girl to the bank before her legs gave out. EMS arrived 6 minutes later. Someone wrapped Nora in a foil blanket that crinkled every time she breathed. She sat on a park bench, soaking wet, both her shoes full of canal water, and watched the paramedics work on the girl. The child was conscious, shaking violently, but conscious. The paramedic who checked Nora was young, thorough, and kept calling her ma'am. "Tell me in the comments before we go any further where you're watching from." I read every single one. When they finally let Nora stand up, a man was waiting. She noticed him the way you notice a storm moving in. Not because he was loud, he was the opposite of loud. He stood apart from the remaining crowd with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that drawing attention was a liability. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing a charcoal wool overcoat that probably cost more than Nora's monthly rent. His face was the kind of handsome that looked like it had been designed to unsettle people, all hard lines and deliberate composure. And he was looking at Nora with an expression she couldn't quite read. 2 men flanked him. They weren't looking at anyone else. Nora looked back at the girl on the stretcher, who was now wrapped in a heated blanket and crying in the grateful way children cried when the danger was over and they were finally allowed to feel it. She was the most beautiful child Nora had ever seen. Dark curly hair plastered to her face, eyes the same grey as the man's, looking up at him with absolute certainty that he would make everything right. He knelt beside the stretcher and spoke quietly to her in a mix of English and something else, something Italian or possibly Sicilian. His hand came up and smoothed the wet hair from the girl's face with a gentleness that didn't match the rest of him at all. Then he stood and walked to Nora. "My name is Luca Ferrano," he said. His voice was low, accented in the way of someone who had learned to erase where he came from and not quite succeeded. "That is my daughter." His expression didn't shift. "She is my daughter," he repeated, and Nora heard something in the second saying of it that the first hadn't contained, the terrified repetition of a man who needed to say it out loud to believe she was still there. "I'm Nora," she said. "Nora Whitfield." He studied her for a moment with grey eyes that gave nothing away. "I'd like to speak with you. When you're," he paused, his gaze dropping briefly to her soaking clothes, the foil blanket, the canal water still dripping from her coat hem. "When you've recovered," he handed her a card, heavy stock, embossed. Just a name and a phone number. Luca Ferrano. No company. Nothing else. Because men like him, Nora was already beginning to understand, didn't need to advertise. She almost didn't call. She stood in her apartment that night, standing over the bathroom sink, watching bruises bloom on her knees from the ice. Her wet clothes were in the tub. Her phone was on the counter with Luca Ferrano's card next to it. She had leftover soup from 2 nights ago, half a box of crackers, and a list of her mother's upcoming medical appointments taped to the fridge. She called. The meeting happened 3 days later in a restaurant on Elgin Street that Nora had walked past 100 times without ever going inside, because it was the kind of place that didn't list prices on the menu. A man who introduced himself as Thomas met her at the door and walked her to a private room at the back. Luca Ferrano was already there, standing by the window with a glass of water. In another suit, this one the deep blue of deep water. He thanked her for coming. He pulled out her chair. He waited until she had tea before he spoke. He told her his daughter's name was Sienna. She was 8 years old. She'd been born in Montreal, lived in Ottawa for the past 3 years. She was funny and stubborn and terrifyingly clever. She could name every province and territory and their capitals. She spoke 2.5 languages. She had been non-verbal for 6 months, following an incident that he described only as a traumatic event, until 3 weeks ago when she had spoken for the first time, to her doctor, to say, slowly and deliberately, that she wanted to go back to the canal to skate again. She loves it, he said. The ice. I couldn't tell her no. He set his water glass down with careful precision. Since the incident, Sienna has had difficulty with attachment, with trusting new adults in her life. He paused. She has not voluntarily touched anyone, other than myself and her grandmother, in 6 months. In the ambulance, Miss Whitfield, she was holding your hand. She wouldn't let go until they made her. Nora thought about the girl's fingers locked around her wrist, white-knuckled, freezing, and how, even after the paramedics arrived, Sienna had turned her head to find Nora's face in the crowd. I need someone to care for my daughter, Luca said. A full-time position. Live-in. Someone she already trusts, which narrows the field considerably to exactly one person, and she is sitting across from me right now drinking Earl Grey. I'm a primary school teacher, Nora said. Not a nanny. You were a nursing student before that. His voice was even. I know you left to care for your mother. I know you work 2 jobs. I know your brother lives in Vancouver and sends money when he can, which is not often. He paused again. I know your mother's home care costs more than you make in a month. Nora went very still. You had me investigated before I let anyone near my daughter. Yes. He didn't apologize for it. I make no apologies for protecting her, and if I say no? He looked at her steadily. Then you go back to your 2 jobs and your Earl Grey, and I respect your decision entirely. He folded his hands on the table. But Sienna asked for you this morning, by name. He let that sit. That is the first time in 6 months she has asked for anyone. Nora looked at her tea. Then she looked at the man across from her, who was watching her the way people watched things they were afraid to lose. What exactly is it that you do, Mr. Ferrano? He met her eyes. I manage assets, right. What kind? The kind that generates significant interest from people who do not always have my best intentions at heart. The ghost of something moved across his face, or Sienna's. She understood then. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough to know that the careful way he moved through the world, the men flanking him everywhere, the private room and the heavy stock business card with nothing but a name. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. She should have said no. The house in Rockcliffe Park was not what she expected, though by now she should have stopped expecting. It was large the way old money was large, without needing to shout about it. Stone exterior, high windows, mature trees that had been planted before Nora's parents were born. The security was discreet. Cameras that blended into eaves. Gates that opened on approach. Men she saw once and then didn't see again, which she suspected meant they were good at their jobs. Her rooms were on the 2nd floor, across the hall from Sienna's. They were nicer than any place Nora had ever lived. Hardwood floors, a window seat, real blackout curtains. She stood in the middle of the room the first morning with her single suitcase and her box of books and thought, this is a mistake I am going to make anyway. Sienna was cautious at first. She watched Nora from doorways. She accepted the proximity without asking for it. She took 3 days before she voluntarily sat beside Nora at the kitchen table, and when she did, she didn't acknowledge it, just opened her book and read while Nora marked her school papers. As if sitting together was something they had always done. On the 5th day, Sienna brought her a drawing. A canal. A woman on the ice with orange hair. Nora didn't have orange hair, but she was moved nonetheless, and a small dark figure being pulled to safety. You made me brave, Sienna said. It was barely above a whisper. Like speech was something she had to use carefully, rationing it. But the words were clear. Nora didn't trust her voice enough to respond out loud. She pressed her hand over the drawing and held it there. Luca was in the house far less than she expected. He left early, returned late, sometimes not until Sienna was already asleep. He was unfailingly polite in the brief exchanges they had. A question about Sienna's appetite. A note left on the kitchen counter about a scheduled appointment. Once a cup of coffee slid onto her desk without a word while she was writing in the early morning. He seemed to understand that the house was Sienna's territory and moved through it accordingly. What he was less good at was concealing the weight he carried. Nora noticed it the way she noticed things, gradually and then all at once. The tension in his shoulders that never fully released. The way his eyes swept every room when he entered, cataloguing exits. The phone calls he took in the study with the door closed. The men who came and went at hours that had nothing to do with normal business. She knew what he was. She didn't know the details, and she suspected the details were the kind that cost people their safety if they knew them. So she didn't ask. She was 3 weeks in when she found the envelope. She was straightening the mudroom, helping the housekeeper because the woman had a bad back, and Nora was constitutionally incapable of watching someone struggle with something she could fix. The mudroom was where the security detail left their gear between rotations, and she was pulling coats from hooks to check pockets before putting them in the wash, the way her mother had taught her. The envelope was in the inside pocket of a coat belonging to a man named Aldrich. She'd heard him called that, the quiet one who positioned himself near the back door, whose eyes she'd caught following Sienna once in a way that had made the hairs on her arm rise and then settle again, because surely she was imagining things. The envelope wasn't sealed. She shouldn't have looked. Photographs. The house. The gates. Sienna's school. Sienna's school, which only a handful of people knew about because Luca changed the routing of drop-offs every week specifically to prevent this. And written in the margin of the top photograph, in a handwriting she didn't recognize, confirmed schedule. Thursday. Today was Tuesday. Nora stood in the mudroom for a long moment. She thought about the canal, about the moment before she crawled out onto the ice. When the sensible part of her brain had done a quick and futile calculation about weight distribution and structural integrity and concluded this was a terrible idea. She had done it anyway. She memorized the contents of the envelope, replaced everything exactly as she'd found it, and put the coat back on its hook. Then she went to find Luca. He was in the study, standing over his desk, 3 phones arranged in front of him, and none of them ringing for once. He looked up when she knocked on the open door, and something in her face made him go still. She told him about the envelope, about the photographs, about Thursday. She watched him very carefully while she spoke, and she was glad she did, because she caught the moment, fractional, suppressed, where his expression cracked, not with surprise, with confirmation. He already suspected someone inside. Nora, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name without the Ms. attached. I need you to tell me exactly what you saw. She told him everything. He asked 2 questions, both precise, and then he made 1 phone call, brief and quiet in Italian. When he hung up, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely pass. You shouldn't have been doing the laundry, he said. I was helping. I know why you were helping. His voice wasn't angry. It was the particular controlled tone of a man managing several things at once. I just mean that you shouldn't have been in a position to find that. Someone tried to plan something against Sienna on a Thursday, Nora said. It's Tuesday. With respect, I think the priority is Thursday, not why I was in the mudroom. Something moved behind his eyes. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, then down at the desk. He was one of my oldest employees, Luca said quietly. I'm already finding that out. You suspected him. I suspected someone. He exhaled. In my world, Miss Whitfield, trust is the most expensive currency there is. Everyone wants it and it costs more than most people can afford. He paused. I'll handle it. And if I'm wrong? He looked up again. You're not wrong. The photographs are enough. And the school route. He stopped. No one outside this house, and 3 other people knew that route. His voice had gone very flat. No one. Nora looked at her hands, then back at him. She thought about Sienna at breakfast that morning, concentrating very hard on eating her toast in triangles, insisting on triangles, explaining to Nora with great seriousness that rectangles were wrong. She thought about the drawing on Nora's desk with the orange-haired woman on the ice. Please be careful, she said. Please actually handle it. He held her gaze. He hesitated, which felt significant on a man for whom hesitation clearly didn't come naturally. I should have listened to you sooner. There were other sites. He paused again. I'll handle it tonight. He stood up, and for a moment they were close enough that she could see the exhaustion under the carefully composed exterior, the shadow of a man who had been holding everything together. For so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to put something down. She left him there. She went back upstairs and sat outside Sienna's door until she was sure the girl was still breathing steadily in her sleep. The man named Aldrich disappeared from the house that night. Nora didn't ask what happened. She had a feeling it was one of those details that cost people their safety. The Thursday Aldrich had planned for passed without incident. In its wake, Luca changed the security entirely. New people, new protocols. He came home earlier. He started staying for dinner instead of leaving a note. Sienna, who noticed everything, noticed this, and began setting a place for him at the table without being asked. The house changed in small ways. Difficult to name, but easy to feel. Nora noticed Luca noticing her when he thought she wasn't looking. She filed this away and did nothing about it, because Sienna was the job, and Sienna needed stability above everything else, and Nora was not the sort of person who set fire to stability for her own convenience. She'd spent 10 years making herself useful, and she wasn't about to stop now. But the night Sienna had a nightmare. A bad one, the kind that left her hollow-eyed and shaking, calling out for her mother who had been gone for 3 years. Nora was already in the doorway when Luke got there. They stood on either side of the girl's bed in the dark, taking turns speaking quietly until Sienna's breathing slowed. Then Sienna reached out and grabbed both their hands at the same time and held on, and Nora felt the awkward hilarity of it, 2 adults standing over a child's bed trying not to make eye contact with each other across the small sleeping form between them. "She's going to be okay," Nora whispered. "I know," Luca said. His voice in the dark was different from his daytime voice, lower, the control deliberately relaxed. He paused. "I think it's because of you." He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at Sienna. She didn't sleep after that. The danger, when it came fast and sideways the way it always does. It was a Saturday in late March, one of those days when Ottawa remembered it was eventually going to be spring and offered a few hours of actual sunlight as a down payment. Luca was in Montreal for the day, negotiations, he'd said, the kind that required his physical presence and couldn't be postponed. He'd left early, reluctantly, checking in with Nora twice before his car even reached the highway. She had Sienna. They were in the backyard, which was enclosed and monitored, playing a game Sienna had invented that involved a hula hoop, a rubber ball, and rules that changed every 10 minutes. The remaining security team was in place. Everything was normal. Then the lights in the back security panel went dark. Not a flicker, not a power blip. Everything died at once, smooth and total, the way it would if someone had found the right junction to cut. Nora's body understood before her mind did. She swept Sienna up off the grass. The girl was small for her age, easier to carry than Nora expected, and moved toward the back door. The back door opened before she reached it. He wasn't someone she recognized, medium height, unremarkable face, the particular calm of a man doing a job he'd done before. He had something in his right hand. "Run," Nora told Sienna. She set the girl down and pointed to the gap in the hedge that led to the neighboring property, the one Luca had quietly arranged with the family next door. The emergency exit that Nora had laughed at, as excessive when he'd shown her. "Inside to the Legrand's, door code 48 Swen, do not stop. Go." Sienna went, Nora turned. She was not trained for this. She wanted to be clear about that in the account she later gave to herself and to Luca. She was a school teacher with a nursing background and a habit of getting into the middle of things that were not her problem. She had a hula hoop in her hand. She threw it. It was a ridiculous thing to do, and it worked anyway. The way ridiculous things sometimes did. It caught the man across the face and he flinched. And in the flinch she shoved the garden chair into his shins and ran for the exterior wall, where the second security panel was. She hit the emergency override. She didn't know if it would work with the power cut. She hit it again. Somewhere behind her she heard the crack of something that was not a garden chair. She hit the ground behind a stone planter as the shot went wide. The override panel had gone red. She didn't know if that meant it had sent the signal or failed to. She pressed herself flat against the planter and thought about Sienna running through the hedge, thought about the door code, thought about Luca in Montreal who didn't know any of this was happening, and felt very clearly and with great precision what it was like to be genuinely afraid. A second man appeared from the side gate. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of footsteps too deliberate to be accidental. And then she heard something else, the sound of the Legrand's back door slamming open, and then Luca Ferrano's voice, low and cold and absolute, in 2 languages at once. It was over very quickly after that. He'd turned around 40 minutes outside the city when his security lead had reached him. He'd driven back the way men drove when something they couldn't afford to lose was in danger. He'd come through the Legrand's, where Sienna was sitting at their kitchen table with their youngest son showing her card tricks, still in her hula hoop game clothes, eyes large but dry. She told him Nora sent her, Luca said. When he finally came to where Nora was sitting on the back step, wrapped in a coat someone had put around her shoulders. His face in the cold evening light was stripped of everything, no composure, no control, just a man who had spent 40 minutes not knowing. She told me first thing. Nora said go, so I went. He sat beside her on the step, which struck Nora as a very un-Luca Ferrano thing to do. "I should have had better people here," he said. "That was my failure. You came back," Nora said. "I should not have left." She looked at her hands. The hula hoop plan was maybe not my best work. He was quiet for a moment, and then, unexpectedly, he laughed. It was a low sound, involuntary, surprised out of him, and it transformed his face into something she hadn't seen before, something almost ordinary. She saved herself with a hula hoop, he said, apparently to no one, and shook his head. They sat there on the step until the cold got into everything and someone came to say the house was clear. When Luca stood and offered her his hand, she took it. He didn't let go on the way inside. The months after that moved differently. Sienna's world expanded. She started going back to school, first half days, then full. She had a best friend by May, a girl named Petra. She chose the name herself for her friend, instructing Nora very seriously that it was important. She began talking in paragraphs, then in long winding stories that she told at dinner, while Luca listened with the absolute attention of a man who understood that every word was a gift. Nora's mother visited in June. Luca quietly ensured the care arrangements while she was away were upgraded, which Nora discovered when her mother mentioned, puzzled, that the new home care aid was wonderful and had appeared with no explanation. Nora confronted him about it in the kitchen. He listened to her with his arms crossed and his expression neutral, and when she finished he said only, "You take care of everyone. Sometimes someone should take care of you." She didn't have a response to that, so she turned back to the stove and didn't say anything and pretended the heat she felt in her face was from the burner. She knew what was happening between them. She suspected he knew what was happening between them. They were both very careful about it, the way you were careful around something fragile and expensive, something that might shatter if you moved too fast. Sienna watched them both with the bright, unsettling attention of a child who had figured out the arithmetic and was waiting for the adults to catch up. One evening in late summer, Nora was reading in the garden when Luca came outside and sat across from her. It was the slow part of the evening, the hour when the light went golden and the city sounds softened, and it was possible to believe that ordinary life was something that happened here too. He didn't say anything at first. He had his phone in his hands and he set it on the table face down, which she'd learned meant he was deliberately setting aside the rest of his life for a specific period of time. "I've been making changes," he said, to the business. She looked up from her book. "Less of what I was doing. More of what I should have been doing." He paused. "It's a long process." He looked at her steadily. "I won't pretend there are no complications ahead. I won't pretend the past is erasable. I don't think you'd believe me if I did." "No," she agreed. "But I'm trying to become the kind of man who is worth trusting with someone like you." Nora put her book down. His eyes were very direct, grey and serious in the evening light. He had his sleeves rolled up from an earlier task in the house, something with a pipe fitting that had defeated everyone else, and she could see the old scar on his forearm that she'd never asked about. There were parts of him she didn't know yet. She suspected there were parts of him he was still learning himself. "I'm not asking for a decision tonight," he said. "I'm asking for the chance to keep trying." He paused. "For Sienna." He paused again. "And for me." Nora looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the canal in February, about the cold and the cracking ice and the choice that had seemed like no choice at all. She thought about the fact that she'd been jumping into things without thinking since she was 23 years old, and it had never once ended the way the sensible part of her brain had predicted. "You already have it," she said. He didn't smile right away. He looked at her first, carefully, the way he looked at things he was trying to understand. And then the smile came, slow and genuine, and it was the most disarming thing she had seen on a man in a long time. They stayed in the garden until the mosquitoes drove them inside, and the conversation that followed was the longest and least guarded she had heard from him. He told her about Montreal, about his father, who had built everything on decisions that had cost the whole family in ways that compounded over decades, about the choices he'd made and the ones he'd been handed and the slow work of separating the two. She told him about the canal, and about her brother, and about the years of making herself useful and quiet and easy because there hadn't been space for anything else, and how somewhere in those years she'd forgotten that she was allowed to want things. He listened to all of it, without once checking his phone. Sienna found them when she came downstairs for water at 10:30, wrapped in her blanket, her curly hair loose around her face. She looked at the two of them sitting at the kitchen table with the unhurried satisfaction of someone whose plan was proceeding exactly on schedule. "Are you going to stay forever?" she asked Nora. Nora looked at Luca. He looked back. "I think I am." Sienna considered this. "Good." She poured her water with the deliberate care of a child who was very precise about water. "I put your name on the winter skating registration," she said, as if this were relevant. "Both of you. It's a pairs thing." She went back upstairs without waiting for a response. Luca looked at his daughter's retreating back, then at Nora. His expression had done something complicated and resolved itself into something simple. "She did that 3 weeks ago," he said. I found the registration confirmation in the printer. Nora thought about the girl who had held her hand in an ambulance and refused to let go, who had learned to speak again in 6 months and had spent every word since then with purpose, who had decided, at 8 years old, with the absolute certainty of someone who knew her own mind, that this was how things were going to be. She's going to be a handful, Nora said. Yes. Luca said it the way you said things that were also blessings. The winter came back around. The canal opened for the season in January, the way it always did, flooding the news with photographs of people gliding through the heart of the city with the distant Parliament buildings behind them. Nora stood at the window of the house in Rockcliffe Park with her coffee and watched the first snow of the year come down on the garden, on the Japanese maple Luca had planted in the autumn for reasons he'd explained, only as I wanted something that would change color every year and remind us it was still moving forward. Behind her, she could hear Sienna arguing with her father about whether her skating helmet needed to be the purple one, or whether the green one that fit better was acceptable. Luca was losing the argument. He always lost the arguments that Sienna had decided to win. He was getting better at knowing the difference. Nora turned from the window. She had come to Ottawa with a broken zipper on her coat and $40, and a bone-deep tiredness she'd stopped noticing because it had been there so long. She had walked through Confederation Park on a shortcut home from a job that barely paid the bills, and she had seen a child with her hands on the broken edge of the ice, and she had not thought about it. She had just run. She had not been trying to find anything. She had been trying to get home. But home, it turned out, was something you sometimes ran into face first in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon in February. Cold and impractical and absolutely worth it. Worth every crack in the ice.